I recently had a conversation with a filmmaker here in Boulder, um, and it was just a meeting of a few different filmmakers here in the local area, and we got sat down, we started talking, and this man is a purist about creating on film. And he talked about it and talked about it, and he has very strong feelings about it. Um, and he yes, and so he knows that he ruffles people's feathers whenever he starts talking against creating or video or making filmmaking via video, which he doesn't consider to be filmmaking because he considers it a misnomer. And he mentioned, of course, that this tends to ruffle feathers, and I said that I didn't necessarily mind that because I think that with the purists, we have something to learn there. I mentioned this idea that we're going to be exploring today, that I consider the the advent of new things to be in a constant dialogue with the old things. I consider, I mentioned this example of photography and um, and and the birth of photography and its impact on the world of portrait making, the portrait painting of the day. And so I think that's a good example because there was a time, as we'll see, that this was considered an existential threat, and of course it did. It strongly impacted the industry of portraiture. Um, that being said, it also cast a new light on the medium that allowed it to grow and expand.
The dawn of photography was considered to be an existential threat to painting, specifically portraiture. And indeed, it basically wiped out the industry in many ways. But the impact of photography is much more nuanced on the overall medium of painting. The two mediums are in dialogue. But what came before? The most significant precursor to the camera was the camera obscura, which just simply meant dark room in Latin. This device consisted of a darkened room or box with a small hole that was later improved with a lens in one wall, and a light passed through the hole projected on an inverted image of the outside scene. This went onto the opposite wall or surface inside the chamber. The principle of the camera obscura was known to the ancient Chinese philosophers like Mozi, who lived between 470 and 391 BC, as well as thinkers such as Aristotle, who also lived well over 2,000 years ago. Also before the advent of true photography. In 1727, Johann Heinrich Schulze demonstrated the darkening effect that was caused by light, not heat. Then along comes Louis Jacques Mondet Daguerre, a former theatrical scene painter who was deeply interested in the camera obscura. Artists like Canaletto and possibly Vermeer had used that particular device to achieve a precision in their work, tracing that projected images. Daguerre wanted to capture these fleeting images, partnered with Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who had already made progress in producing permanent images using a process called heliography. But that required really long exposures. After Niepce's death in 1833, Daguerre continued to refine those experiments and really focused on improving the sensitivity and practicality of the process. Fate would play a hand, as well as rigorous experimentation. He discovered that the silver-plated copper sheet, when exposed to iodine vapors, formed a coating of light-sensitive silver iodide. This plate, when placed in a camera and exposed to light, captured a latent or invisible image. It was this next step, that latent image, that happened by accident. Daguerre stored one of the exposed plates in a cabinet that contained various chemicals, and to his surprise, he found that a clear image had developed on the plate. Through careful elimination, he identified mercury vapor, which had leaked from a broken thermometer, as being responsible for that image. By holding up the exposed plate over heated mercury, the vapor amalgamated with the silver in the light-struck areas, and that made the image visible. What came next was an era of daguerreotype mania, as it's been called, and the backlash was intense. Honore Daumier, Paul Gauguin, Paul Delaroche, and to a certain extent, Vincent van Gogh opposed photography. Daumier would say that photography imitates everything and expresses nothing. Gauguin said that machines have come and art is fled, and I am far from thinking photography can help us. Van Gogh, an attack on certain opponents, described them as photographic and empty perfection, suggesting a certain contempt for the realism of, or the dryness, perhaps, of the expression of the camera. The painter Delaroche declared that from today, painting is dead. That was after he saw one of the first daguerreotypes around 1839 to 1840. The threat to painting was existential. This technology, viewed as mechanical, as lifeless, devoid of the human spirit, was seen as just another moment in the Industrial Revolution where something deeply human would be overturned by something mechanical. Delaroche had truly more nuanced views. At a later point, he described photography as a great advantage for art. And indeed, you see so many artists beginning to use photographic references instead of individual sitters. Lady Elizabeth Eastlake said in an influential essay published in Quarterly Review in 1857 that art ever aims at something beyond mere mechanism at the bottom of it. This was seen as an essential point of critique regarding photography. William Morris, who was a polymath and artist and a textile maker, found himself concerned with the mass production of art in the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. But he also said that you can't have art without resistance in the material. While he may not have been specifically talking about photography, the sentiment is that making things involves getting your hands dirty, about applying yourself against the raw materials of the medium and giving them shape. Absorbs the function of precision and documentation. And you can see this in the work of Edward Muybridge. You can see this in the role that photography also plays in the sciences as a documentation, in addition to its role in photography. You can see this as photographers document the Old West in the American frontier. But this artificial eye of the camera was something that Gustave Legray, Eugène Cuvelier, Henri Lesser, as well as artists like Edouard Manet, Edgar Degas, and other impressionists would use as part of a new way of looking at the world. Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, others all learned from the science of photography, and this led to new techniques, trying to push beyond the boundaries of what photography could see, trying to push beyond the boundaries of the lens and typical perception, something beyond photography's reach. Much as photography was perceived as being truthful, as being objective, photographs could also be manipulated. And this became readily apparent in the mid-1840s. Photographers were beginning to retouch images and combine negatives and creating composites. And this undermined the idea that photographs were objective, like real glimpses into reality. And this fueled the skepticism, dividing critics and artists of the time. And, at last, by the 1860s, much of the portrait painting industry had disappeared. Many remaining portrait makers relied on daguerreotypes as source material instead of live sitters.
there's an interesting tension at the heart of this conversation about photography and about painting. Because deep down, this is about two things. It's about many things, but it's about two things: representation and expression. And you find an interesting back and forth when there's this moment where painting isn't really about documentation anymore. It's about something different. It's about a greater expression, a greater fragmentation in worldview, in perception.
This was no longer about competing with photography's ability to record moments of truth. Rather, it was a moment of liberation and allowed them to represent what they saw in new ways, focusing on color and light, movement, all these things that photography could not do. Photography as reference, although they were keeping it a secret out of fear of the public reaction to the fact that they were dabbling with such dark arts. While they were publicly skeptical about photography, they were secretly using them as references, such as can be seen in Manet and Gauguin's work, especially with regards to characteristic frontal lighting that flattens subjects, similar to flash photography, though there were no photographs found among his possessions after Manet's death. In this moment, photography liberates painting from representation, meaning there are new frontiers, new room for exploration, things that had never been discovered before. But the influence goes further, with the development of genres of painting like photorealism, pictorialism, and genre painting itself. But there's something else happening. There's a back and forth, a dialogue between the two mediums. Alfred Stieglitz, Julia Margaret Cameron, Clarence H. White really begin to explore the expressive capacity for photography, trying to capture scenes, capture expressions, capture literary moments. I find here Henri Cartier-Bresson's reflection to be deeply interesting. He says, "For me, the camera is a sketchbook, an instrument of intuition and spontaneity, the master of the instant which, in visual terms, questions and decides simultaneously. In order to give a meaning to the world, one has to feel involved in what one frames through the viewfinder." There is contrast, though. Auguste Sander in 1931 said that photography is by nature a documentary art. In the same way, there are clear similarities between the works of a landscape photographer like Ansel Adams and the landscape painters such as the Hudson River School that came before him, such as Albert Bierstadt, Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, and Thomas Moran. Just as much as the photographic eye was becoming compound like that of a fly in the works of Dadaism and Surrealism, Constructivism and Bauhaus and modernist abstraction, it was also taking on a role in capturing grandeur and beauty of nature and a romantic sensibility that had been seen already in the new forms that it unlocked in painting, such as abstract expressionism and impressionism, vortographs, the works of Man Ray, photograms, rayographs. All of these became major elements in the development of experimental photography. André Breton wrote in his first manifesto in 1924 the document that would spark the birth of Surrealism. And he placed photography at the center of his practice. Man Ray, who I just mentioned, as well as Maurice Tabard, were surrealist photographers and used techniques like double exposure, combination printing, montage, and solarization to create images that evoked dream and reality merging.
So you might ask, Clayton, what are you trying to say? Really? Well, fundamentally, I believe that the purist, just like the syncretist and the avant-garde frontiersman, they all have something to teach us. It can't be reduced to a right or wrong with regards to a purity around a subject. It can't be reduced to this medium has an exclusive monopoly on subject matter, on a way of looking at the world. Because everything is always in dialogue with everything else. Like Indra's net cast across the universe, with every point in it reflecting every other point. Now you might ask, is this about AI? And it's easy to make that comparison because that is particularly salient in our mind. And it's really not the case that that's what I'm making, because there are substantial differences in this. But that being said, that there are likely to be substantial correspondences as well between how the particular episode in the development of photography and painting represents how two art forms commune in the same way art today is going to be in a sort of communion with what AI is producing. But it is important to remember that the catalyzation brought on by something new, whether it's photography or AI, is painful and dramatic. It is intense, and we're seeing that. And that's real, and it's important to take note of. Because increasingly, I find myself torn between a state of awe at AI and a state of disillusionment. That polarity is growing for me. It's not shrinking. I'm not having that dissonance resolved. Because I see the potential, but I also see the AI slop. But I think that in the tensions, that's the place to be. To find the fruitfulness, the truth of engaging with things that are complicated, messy, and sometimes dangerous. The grammars of our mediums, our technology, and our techniques, they continue to evolve, they continue to dialogue. And the threats to the existence of a field are often transformed into catalysts that force an individual that's working in a particular medium or technology to reimagine it. So this is less about fearing an extinction type event with regards to the development of new media and new technologies, and more about realizing, although chaotic and seemingly disastrous, this is about the transformation of an ecosystem rather than an extinction. It is about change. It is about a radical, radical change.